What if I told you that changing the way you eat after a serious diagnosis could change your healing trajectory and increase your odds of survival? In this episode, you'll discover why nutrition shows up so often in remarkable recovery stories, how food can influence both our healing capacity and timeline, and how to think about dietary change without turning food into something to be fearful about, a perfectionist about, or another impossible protocol. Stay with me until the end because I'll help you identify the first nutrition shift that may matter most for your body right now. After a serious diagnosis, food and nutrition are oftentimes one of the first things someone starts to examine. Unfortunately, the conversation around nutrition, especially during chronic illness, can be massively confusing. One person tells you to stop eating sugar, and another tells you to cut out meat. Another tells you to eat more protein. Someone else says to fast. Someone says to juice, go vegan, go keto. Some say supplements are essential. Some say they're dangerous. And suddenly something as ordinary as breakfast can start to feel like a medical decision, turning nutrition into both an opportunity and a burden. That is not what I want for you. Because when food becomes medicine, it doesn't mean that nutrition needs to become another thing to stress out about. It simply means that food can become one of the most practical daily ways you participate in your healing journey. If this episode resonates with you, you may also want to go back and listen to episode 22, Your Healing Nutrition Blueprint, because that episode gives a broader foundation for how food shapes disease and recovery. Today, I want to look at nutrition through the lens of one remarkable recovery story. The recovery stories I share here rarely feature a story of someone who ate perfectly every single day, and I'll tell you now, they even more rarely feature the same diet each time. But they will help us address the question of what happens when a person facing impossible odds begins using food as one part of a much larger healing path. The story I want to share today comes from the book Remarkable Recovery by Carol Hirschberg and Mark Ian Baraschke. The man in this story is Norman Arnold. Norman was 52 years old when his life changed. At that point, he had been happily married for 20 years. He had 3 growing sons. He was the CEO and president of one of the largest liquor distributors in the country, and he was deeply involved in civic and philanthropic work in his community. He was in the middle of a full life with a family, business, responsibilities, plans, and future he expected to keep living. Then in the fall of 1981, Norman began feeling a sharp, persistent pain in his lower back. At first, the diagnosis was gallstones. He went into surgery expecting one thing, but his surgeon found something much more devastating. A tumor on the head of his pancreas, with metastases to lymph nodes and the liver. The diagnosis was metastatic pancreatic cancer. This was the kind of diagnosis where time suddenly becomes part of every conversation. Norman's wife, Jerry Sue, heard the news first. In her shock, she began naming the ordinary future they still had on the calendar. A family ski trip, their son's bar mitzvah in the spring. But when the doctor asked if they could move the kid's bar mitzvah up, she realized the time frame being discussed was far shorter than she could comprehend. That is the difficulty of a diagnosis like this. One moment you're thinking about travel, children, work, holidays, and the ordinary rhythm of family life. The next moment, everyone around you is recalculating how much time there may be. Norman went through a brief period of depression, which is deeply understandable. He had wanted more time to see his children grow, but he didn't stay there. His response became, in essence, that is what the doctors say. Now let's see what I can do. Norman did not deny the seriousness of the prognosis, but he also didn't treat the prognosis as the only possible ending to his story. While he was in the hospital recovering from his surgery, he came across an article about a physician who reportedly recovered from cancer using a macrobiotic diet, a way of eating centered around vegetables, beans, sea vegetables, whole grains, and a broader philosophy of balanced living. Something in that article gave Norman hope. He had always been interested in his health in certain ways. He understood exercise, but by his own admission, his diet had not been a healing diet. He had eaten heavily with a lot of meat, rich foods, and sugar. Food had been part of his life, but definitely not part of his medicine. Now, suddenly, food became one of the first places he felt like he could act. When Norman came home from the hospital, his wife had arranged for a couple trained in macrobiotic cooking to help them begin. This couple taught the family how to prepare foods that were completely different from the way Norman had been eating before. Brown rice, beans, sea vegetables, simple preparations, and meals built around a very different philosophy. And for Norman, something about that philosophy made sense. It was not only the food itself, it was the idea of getting well and not just buying time. He did not approach this passively. He began looking for evidence that someone with pancreatic cancer had survived using this particular kind of approach. Norman contacted people and asked questions. He had his lawyer search records. He looked for living cases, and once he found them, he knew he could have faith in the power of this kind of nutrition to heal him. A strict macrobiotic diet meant Norman could no longer live the same way he had before. He could not simply eat whatever was convenient. He could not travel impulsively. He had to be home for meals or carry food with him. His social life changed. Some friends were supportive, some found it strange, some laughed, but everybody was watching to see what would happen. That is something people do not always understand about a serious healing journey. When you begin making different choices, especially with food, your private diagnosis can become socially visible. People notice, ask questions, judge, project their own fear. Some might cheer you on and some might distance themselves. And through it all, you have to keep choosing the pathway you've chosen anyway. And Norman kept choosing. Eventually, Norman found an aggressive chemotherapy protocol that one doctor had used to successfully extend the lifespan of patients from 9 months to 18 months. Wanting as much time as he could have, Norman decided to try it. Once he started the medical treatment, Norman lost a tremendous amount of weight and became increasingly discouraged by the idea that the chemotherapy was only delaying the inevitable. Eventually, against his oncologist's strong objections, he chose to stop. He and his family went on a long-awaited vacation in the Bahamas. There he rested, listened to healing visualization tapes, spent time with his family, looked at the water, played games, swam, continued his macrobiotic diet, and came home saying he could feel himself getting better. A few months later, he returned to his doctor looking remarkably well. His physician assumed he had continued chemotherapy treatment, but when Norman explained he had actually stopped and was simply continuing with the macrobiotic diet and the visualizations, the doctor was stunned by how healthy he looked. According to his account in Remarkable Recovery, 7 months after diagnosis, imaging showed a normal pancreas and no evidence of liver metastases. Several months after that, blood work, imaging, and other tests showed no sign of disease. Years later, alive and well, Norman climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. It's important to note that Norman pursued healing from multiple directions. He used conventional treatment, he explored alternatives, he subscribed to medical journals and newsletters, he worked with physicians, he practiced mental imagery, he went to a center that helped patients work with the emotional and psychological side of illness, he spent more time with his family, and he looked for people who had survived. He was deeply engaged in his healing. So what was it? Was it the chemotherapy, the macrobiotic diet, imagery, family support, the profound emotional lift of feeling he was doing something helpful? Was it the biology of his particular cancer? The honest answer is we don't know. Norman himself did not claim with certainty. What he did seem to believe was that the combination of changes gave him an emotional and psychological lift that strengthened his body's ability to fight. But without a doubt, food was one of the ways Norman began participating in his own survival every single day, and he credits it as one of the top healing factors. Nutrition shows up again and again in Remarkable Recovery stories because food touches so many parts of our physiology at once. First, food provides the raw materials the body uses to stay alive, defend itself, repair damage, and rebuild what illness has broken down. This is one reason nutrition matters so deeply in a healing journey. The body has an extraordinary innate capacity for repair, but repair requires the necessary nutrients. It requires minerals like magnesium, zinc, selenium, and iron to help countless cellular reactions take place. It requires healthy fats to build flexible cell membranes, repair cells, and produce signaling molecules and hormones. It requires vitamins and phytonutrients to help regulate oxidative stress, inflammation, detoxification, energy production, and cellular communication. When the body is under the stress of serious illness, those needs increase. If the raw materials are missing, the body is forced to triage nutrients and save them for the most basic survival processes instead of allotting them towards healing processes. Food influences blood sugar and insulin. Blood sugar is part of the main metabolic environment in which disease unfolds. When glucose and insulin are chronically elevated or swinging up and down all day, the body receives a very different signal than it does from steady, nourishing meals. High blood sugar can increase oxidative stress and inflammation. This is one of the reasons sugar and refined carbohydrates can become such a significant issue in a healing journey. If someone is skipping meals, eating mostly refined foods, drinking sweetened beverages, or riding a daily roller coaster of caffeine, sugar, crashes, and cravings, their body is spending enormous energy just trying to regain stability. Stabilizing blood sugar is a way of reducing metabolic chaos, so the body has a steadier foundation for repair, resilience, and healing. Also, food can either fuel inflammatory pathways or help the body resolve them. Inflammation is not inherently bad. It's part of how the body fights infection, heals wounds, clears damaged cells, and responds to threat. But chronic, unresolved inflammation is different. That kind of inflammation can keep the body in a state of alarm, draining energy, disturbing sleep, affecting pain, weakening your resilience and immune system, and creating an internal environment where disease has more room to take hold. This is why food quality matters so much. Highly processed foods, excess sugar, refined carbohydrates, alcohol, processed meats, certain industrial oils, and foods a person clearly reacts to can add burden to a body that's already fighting hard. On the other side of the equation, deeply colored vegetables and fruits, herbs, spices, beans, whole foods, quality protein, healthy fats, minerals, fiber, and phytonutrients can provide the body with the raw materials and biochemical signals it uses to regulate inflammation, repair tissue, produce energy, support detoxification, and communicate at the cellular level. Additionally, food shapes gut health, and the gut is one of the major crossroads of healing biology. This is where food is broken down, nutrients are absorbed, immune cells are trained, inflammatory signals are influenced, and the body decides over and over again what is safe and what is a threat. That means digestion, absorption, microbiome, integrity of the gut lining all matter. If someone is eating healthy food but not breaking it down or absorbing it, then the body may be eating but not truly receiving. And if the body cannot receive nourishment, it cannot fully use that nourishment to heal. This is why nutrition has to be personal. Not everyone will benefit from following the same dietary patterns. A food can be healthy in theory and still wrong for a body that can't digest it or utilize it. And finally, food affects our agency. When you choose a meal that supports your body, you're not just eating, you're participating. You're reminding yourself, sometimes several times a day, that your body can heal and is worth caring for. Norman recognized this. His meals were empowerment. They gave him hope. They were repeated reminders that he was doing something to improve his health. That is why nutrition shows up so often in remarkable recovery stories. But if these stories don't all point to one perfect diet, what pattern do they point to? The pattern I see is a shift away from foods that deplete the body and towards foods that nourish, stabilize, and support repair. For many people, this means removing or greatly reducing the foods that most likely work against healing. Things like ultra-processed foods, refined sugar, alcohol, processed meats, fried foods, artificial ingredients and fillers, and foods that clearly trigger symptoms or inflammation. For many people, it also means adding what the body has been missing. Vegetables, colorful plant foods, herbs, spices, minerals, high-quality protein, healthy fats, clean water, fiber, fermented foods, and meals made from ingredients the body can actually recognize and use. Norman chose macrobiotics. That was the path that made sense to him, and it became a powerful structure in his healing journey. But the deeper lesson is not that every person must become macrobiotic. It's that food became a serious, daily, intentional part of his healing environment. So if you're listening right now and wondering where to begin, I want you to take a big breath. You do not have to figure out the perfect diet today. Choose one change and make it really easy. One breakfast that stabilizes you, one processed food you stop buying, one vegetable you add daily, one protein source you tolerate, one glass of water before having any coffee. Whatever it is, this is how nutrition becomes healing instead of overwhelming. The next step is to pay attention to your own response to your diet. Notice your energy, appetite, digestion, cravings, pain, mood, sleep, bowel movements, weight, strength, and labs. Every meal is part of a larger healing environment. So remember that food is powerful, but it's not the whole story. Norman changed food, but he also worked with physicians, practiced healing imagery, spent time with his family, and allowed them to support him, rested, researched, and changed the way he related to his own prognosis. Recognizing this is important because it keeps us from putting too much pressure on food alone. If this episode helped you think about food with less fear and more possibility, follow Renegade Remission so you can stay connected to this larger healing conversation. We are walking through the pillars that show up again and again in remarkable recovery stories: nutrition, movement, stress, mindset, emotional healing, trauma, purpose, and community. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, this may be an episode worth sending them. Thanks for spreading the word, and as always, go be renegades.